I wanted people to know what a great scientist he is and how he has impacted where computer science is today. And I wanted to lay out, to the extent that we could with this project, a whole picture of his ideas and his work and the person.
I had a very excellent way of managing John. It was very simple. I would ask John what he was going to do, and then I'd agree. And it worked very well, and he never disappointed himself, and he never disappointed me.
Most people somehow mature to a kind of age of 13, and exceptionally mature people will go on to be presidents, and corporation presidents may get up to 15. The typical scientist is about 11, and John is somewhere between 9 and 10.
I looked in my rear view mirror, and there was John in his tattered overcoat, because he always wore a very tattered overcoat, riding the unicycle in circles around on this square. And I thought, who else but John would be seen in the middle of a giant snowstorm riding a unicycle on this square, wearing that tattered overcoat and going yip, 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 yip.
Ralph Palmer, who was then head of the development laboratory, called about 20 of us and said we weren't going on vacation that year. That instead of having, the plant had a vacation, a regular vacation period that we all went. Instead of taking vacation that time, we were all going to get together and decide what we were going to do about the next generation of computers from the hardware standpoint.
Steve Dunwell raised our sights and tried to make us see that we were designing a high-performance machine for general applicability.
There was people who were legitimately computer architects like Fred Brooks and Jerry Blau who actually knew something, right? I was just there learning.
Steve asked John to please describe, how he saw how we could improve the concurrency of operation on the stretch and speed it up. And John started describing this in his usual enthusiasm, and he ended up drawing on all of our napkins, timing diagrams, timing charts.
The 2 microsecond core memory that they used in the 7090 was developed for that project, and a way to drive the memory with transistors.
A direct order came down that no one was allowed to be seen with vacuum tube equipment. No one was allowed to have any on a bench. If you wanted to work on vacuum tube equipment, you had to hide it. Literally, physically had to hide it. And that was the way in which the word was gotten through to everybody, that they couldn't fall back on what they knew about vacuum tubes. If they ran into a problem with transistors they didn't know how to solve. They had to solve their problem.
Back in the days when they were doing the stretch computer, there was a problem that came up, which was that the memory couldn't be made fast enough to keep up with the hardware.
In order to not exceed the Curie point, the whole thing was kept in oil. And it was a great pain. I mean, if you drag it out of oil, it dripped, it did this, it did that. And the motion caused the cores to turn on the and wear out.
Incidentally, it was one of the members of the Stretch Project that came up with the word byte that's now in the dictionary.
In the Stretch Project, we had a chance to build a machine for speed without worrying about cost. And this drove us to attempt things nobody had ever attempted before.
John's the only person well, one of the very few people I know whose IQ is higher than his blood cholesterol level.
I met John in 1974 when I first came to interview at IBM. It was pretty interesting. Joe Birnbaum was my host. He was at the time a senior manager in the department, and he was explaining to me the people on the agenda, and he said, "Oh, John Cocke, this is the smartest man in the United States." He didn't look like the smartest man in the United States, but he said, "Well, what are you working on?" I thought, well, since he's well known for computer architecture, I'm on relatively safe ground. I will tell him about digital signal processing. And I started describing my thesis. And about 5 minutes into my description, he went to the board and wrote more or less the essence of the rest of my thesis. So that was a pretty rude awakening.
If he got interested in a particular topic, it was like sort of a dog grabbing hold of that bone, and you can't shake him from it.
This is the end. You know, there are no new ideas. We're going to write the manual. We're going to send it to development to build it. We're going to do something. And you can't, no more ideas here, John.
His scientific style is one in which he keeps circling back to the same question. And like, I think of it sometimes like a dog worrying a bone. You know, he'll chew away at it for a while and then forget about it for a while, but then always come back to the same bone and chew on it some more.
And seeing Ed Sussenguth in his very kind way, pulling John by John's tie out of Ed's office and saying, "No, John, we settled that yesterday."
Peoria told him he wanted a large machine project similar to Stretch and this and that, to what it had been. And so Jack asked me to help him put such a project together.
He was regarded as the principal thinker by Jack Bertram, who was the manager of the project, and he relied on John to set the key technical directions both in hardware and software.
The object at the time was to build a machine that was 1,000 times faster than the then prevalent 7090 class machines, which would have made it an incredibly powerful computer. As a matter of fact, it would rank up with some of the high-speed machines that we have today.
We were a little naive in those days about how to sell projects, and we had all kinds of ways that how we would spend our money and design it in certain ways so that its cost performance would be highly optimized. And we had various charts about how this was going to be the case. We would give them to Peoria, and Peoria would say, "No, Watson wants the fastest computer. Forget all this business about, you know, trying to make it cost performance, and figure out how to make it the fastest scientific computer out."
I've worked with a lot of very talented people in my 30 years in the company. I have never had a group of such talented people all in one place as that ACS group was. I think if they asked us to make pens, we could have made the world's best pen. It was just a great group of people.
The project collapsed mainly because of technology. It was not quite available at the time. But I think in a greater sense, it wasn't possible for ACS to take on the entire System 360 line, you know, head on, the way Stretch took on the 704 and have a hope to win.
John is one of the few people that actually did what you always hear about, which is try to write on a blackboard with the end of a cigarette while he put the chalk in his mouth with his other hand.
I was in my office, and the door opened, and John, of course I didn't know who it was, came in. And he started talking to me, I would say, about everything. Okay, it wasn't about any one thing. And I really didn't know whether I was talking to someone who seemed to know everything or whether he was just, you know, crazy.
Working with John is a unique kind of thing. The typical experience, if I could think of a day, is that you're sitting at your desk or wherever it is doing the thing you're supposed to do. And a couple of times a day or every third day, John walks into your office and starts writing on the blackboard. Usually you have some idea what it is. Most of the time you don't have any idea what he's talking about. And sooner or later, you realize that he is doing something that fits into what you're doing, and it's so far ahead of what you're doing, and you're able to catch up to him. It's not like working with other people.
I remember my neighbor saying, well, how can you do any work? Because, you know, you always have John in there writing on your blackboard, and I cannot concentrate. So I said, well, you know, you should start listening. Maybe you'll get some good ideas.
He would sort of go from one room to another and to one lab to another, you know, spreading ideas and trailing cigarette ashes as he went along.
I met John Cocke when I came to IBM for a job interview in 1965, and after I'd spoken to a few people, they inserted him onto the schedule. And at that time, John was just getting ready to leave to start for California with what was to become the ACS project. And for some reason, he decided that I would be a good person to join that project, but he told me that he wasn't allowed to tell me what the project was about, nor what it would be doing or what my role would be, but he encouraged me to come because he thought I would find it just right. This seemed a little vague to me, and I guess he could tell that I might not want to move to California based on that amount of information. So he said, the hell with it, I'll show you all this stuff even though I'm not supposed to. And he opened the file cabinet, which turned out to be full of dirty shirts, which he then proceeded to dump out onto the drawer and rummage about for 4 or 5 minutes, and then said, let's forget about all this and let me have you meet some of the other people in the project. Well, I decided to join Yorktown, but it wasn't until several years later when John and the others came back that I really got to know John, but I never did quite forget the breaking of the IBM image that I had in my mind up until meeting John.
Well, there was a time when every time you tried to get into John Cocke's office, you were in danger of knocking over a pile of shirt boxes. They'd start that high, and then they were that high and that high and that high. And it turned out the reason there were so many shirt boxes in John's office was that he liked to wear a clean shirt every day, but he never could get around to taking them to the laundry. So he'd just buy a new shirt when he felt he needed one, put the old shirt, usually I think he changed at the lab, put the old shirt in the shirt box and put it on the top of the pile. It was, some of us keep papers on our desk on the same principle, that you can find things by an archaeological method. You know approximately when you last saw it, so you know how far down the pile it must be. Well, I think John's shirts were organized on the same arrangement. I think finally when they got right up to the ceiling, somebody convinced him that he could actually get these shirts washed at the laundry.
I don't think John ever had an office. Basically, he had a closet, and it had a desk in it, and it just was full of papers and clothes and cigarette butts and whatever else John happened to have with him. John's office was the halls, and he would just walk around and drop into people's offices. Usually was very welcome, I think. Dropped in anyway, whether he was welcome or not.
George Radin popped up in my office and said that they wanted to run a project to design a CPU, and he kind of outlined to me a little bit about it. This is what eventually became the first 801. And I was very cool to this because he didn't name any numbers. I said, George, what's the use? If you can, refine this stuff and make something that runs 20% better, it's not going to really do us anything. And he said, it isn't 20%. I said, what is it? And he said, well, it's more like factors of 2 or 3. So I said, gee, if you can do that, I'm interested.
John would camp in my office and really say, Abe, we have to do this, and so on. And it was. I mean, it was the right time and the right set of ideas.
John, because of his deep understanding and contributions to optimizing compilers, said the appearance of the optimizing compiler makes it possible for us to go essentially backward in computer design, back to the days of the most primitive computers with the RISC concept.
And John says, remember that PDP-1?
John recognized the coming together of optimizing compiler technology, instruction and data caching, and the possibility then to go back to the, away from microprogrammed computers, back to essentially user microprogrammed computers, or really compiling directly to microcode as a way of getting maximum computer speed.
Played godfather to all of the major technical areas in the architecture of the machine, and in a lot of ways in the tools for the machine, both of which were necessary to drive as far and as hard as we did. John basically had free rein to go in and fix things by convincing people, and if he couldn't convince people, he'd come down and beat me up, and I'd convince them.
I was a part of that all the way through, trying to get various parts of IBM to adopt it, which was hard because they were all committed to their own machines.
It's the only time in the 15 years I was at IBM when the company got its brightest people and said to them, build us the best product that you can, that you think is the best product you can do. And didn't force it into a lot of compromises, at least not until it was very far down the path. And the result really shows, and I hope very much that the IBM management has learned a lesson from that, because if the whole company had products that were as outstanding as that one is, how good my retirement would be.
I don't really like characterizing John, say, as the person who invented RISC, but that characterization would be enough to make any other person famous.
Most of the modern concepts of compiler technology were concepts that John was responsible for seeding throughout the universities and IBM.
I had the actual honor to be John's manager at the time when he received the Turing Award. John is not a person that sits down at a desk for any length of time. On the other hand, the Turing Award has a great tradition. You have to submit a paper which is subsequently published and with an interview.
He never has liked writing. He's never really written much. So he depends a lot on people who, so to speak, write for him.
I used to go around, sort of follow him around, taking notes and trying to capture his brilliant ideas as they were bubbling forth.
I would walk with him and solicit what he really would like to say. And eventually, and as a matter of fact, Al Chang would join us and Fran Allen. And we reconstructed something that was really fascinating to me because I didn't know many of the things, how chronologically John's ideas developed over the years.
He's carrying forward a vision that he really had in the late 50s. Probably before that, but a vision that's kind of a continual vision. It's been evolving, and I think that's been. He is a visionary. There's no question about that. John is above everything else a visionary, but more than a visionary, he can do the detailed thinking and science to carry that out.
It's not just technology. He knows all about golf and baseball and history and everything.
I passed the exam for being a licensed air conditioning contractor.
He also helped me choose my current wife, and he had very good taste.
I remember one time John called me up to tell me his theory of dreams. And when he first told me this, I thought, boy, there's a strange theory if I ever heard one. But I have been interested in what he told me ever since. And this has to be, it's hard for me to tell you how long ago, but it's probably 20, 25 years ago. And I'm now convinced that his theory of dreams is correct, and it's the only correct theory of dreams.
Can't predict what John will come up with, and it will always be original, and it'll often be brilliant.
He told me what he was doing in this regard, which was to analyze, to compare the legislation in English with that in French that was being produced in Quebec, where they're bilingual and where the laws were required to be published in both languages.
Many, many years ago, John talked about things that are not a lot different than the new digital video cameras that are just starting to get to be real, except John's was more advanced, so it'll take Japan a few more years to catch up with them.
If you take a picture of a hydrogen bomb exploding, they have lots of different film, several layers of film with different exposures. And that gives it hard to make it. So you have the aperture very small because you're not too worried about brightness if it's an H-bomb. And you can stop down the shutter, and so it makes the depth of field more. And then you can have layers of film, so you get more than one exposure possible, you know. So that was sort of, I was thinking of applying that to something that an individual could do. And no doubt when they get diode electronic photography, they will be able to make pictures much better than you can print and so forth, which we ought to start doing as soon as we can and save the pictures till the day we get technology to make the printing okay. You know, get a picture that's better than you can possibly display, which sounds sort of crazy, but anyway, it can be saved for future generations.
But all his ideas were in his head. As a matter of fact, the ideas that he already had will be pursued for many more years until they can be implemented in a effective manner.
I think John's impact on the field of computing is seminal, pervasive, profound, will be enduring.
The men and women we honor exemplify not simply the life of man, of the mind, but the spirit of adventure and risk that accompanies the quest for advancement. In honoring each of you, this nation honors the boundless horizons of the human mind, the soaring spirit of inquiry, the special genius of the architects who fashioned today's fantastic idea into tomorrow's usable tool.
John Cocke, for his development and implementation of reduced instruction set computer architecture that significantly increased the speed and efficiency of computers, thereby enhancing U.S. technological competitiveness.
I have a lot of curiosity and enthusiasm about things, and if something seems a lot better, I would like to have it done that way, right? And so I mean, I try to do well.